Hello, my name is Amanda Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. This podcast features recordings of talks given at Science on Tap, a series of science lectures held in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. This episode is a recording of a talk on the topic Parasites, a Global Health Problem, given by Dr. Buddy Ullman, who is a parasitologist at Oregon Health and Science University. A quick word of warning: parasites can be really, really gross and super fascinating, and Buddy is hilarious. If that's your kind of thing, then keep listening. Also, I've uploaded this as an enhanced podcast, so depending on which app you're using to listen, you can even see the slides he showed during the talk. That is, if you want to. Anyway, here we go.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I am a faculty member at the Oregon Health and Science University. I'm also a teacher. I've taught medical students there for 29 years. And usually when I teach medical students, they're forced to come to my lectures. But here it's amazing to be able to talk to volunteers. So when Amanda first contacted me and asked me to talk about parasites, there were sort of two general areas that I thought about talking about to you people. The first sort of comes immediately to mind to any scientist is to talk about the science in their laboratory. And I'm a research scientist. I'm a molecular parasitologist. And in my laboratory, we use molecular, biological, and genetic tools to dissect unique transport, metabolic, and organellar targeting pathways in protozoan parasites. And I can see just by the audience that some of you are already closing your eyes, so I chose not to talk about that, but rather to spend the time telling you a little bit about the global significance of parasites and the diseases that they cause. So we're going to start with the first slide here, which is a cartoon that comes from a movie that was made in 1982 starring my favorite American actress, Demi Moore. And this movie got panned terribly, but it is my favorite movie. And it depicts parasites as something that's terrible and dangerous and harmful that could injure you, maybe even kill you. And I want to assure all the audience at the outset of this talk that parasites are far, far worse than what this cartoon depicts. So what's a parasite? A parasite is an organism that derives benefit from its host, usually injures the host, but very rarely does a parasite kill its host. Why does a parasite not want to kill its host? That's right. All organisms have an evolutionary propensity to self-perpetuate themselves. If a parasite kills its host, the parasite dies. It's not good for the parasite. So parasites tend to cause insidious diseases. Rarely, or at least relatively rarely, do they cause fatal diseases. Now, there are a variety of different kinds of organisms that meet the technical definition of a parasite. They're viruses, they're bacteria, they're fungi that are certainly are considered parasites, but by virtue of the fact that viruses and bacteria and fungi cause so many diseases in the United States and in developed nations, they're actually studied under separate domains. So virologists study viruses, bacteriologists study bacteria, mycologists study fungi, and we parasitologists, we study those organisms that are relegated to us by universal disinterest among the biomedical establishment. So we tend to study protozoan parasites, helminthic parasite. A helminth is just a fancy word for worm, and also ectoparasites. Those are the parasites that are on the outside of the body, and those would include insects like lice, ticks, et cetera, et cetera. Now, most people in the United States, and the reason that very few of you got all the answers right, or even 8, and none of you got 8 or more answers right, is that there's really not much known by the average American about parasites. And that's because most people in the United States think of parasitic diseases as esoteric and rare. And so on the next slide, I compiled data that were obtained by the World Health Organization, which is an organization in Geneva, Switzerland, which is responsible for monitoring the prevalence of the major parasitic diseases. And you can see these numbers are enormous. So Ascariasis, 1.4 billion people, that's about 22% of the world's population. Hookworm, 1.2 billion, of course hookworm is prevalent in Oregon. Trichiniasis, 980 million people. How many of you have heard of trichiniasis? None of you? I can't really see very well. One, medical student, okay. But I'm asking the humans in the audience. But so none of you, and Heather is my friend. So almost 1 billion people, and this is a disease that none of you have ever heard of. And the numbers are enormous. 2 out of 3 people worldwide are afflicted with a parasitic disease. And that is an underestimate of the number of parasitic diseases, because most people who are afflicted with a parasite actually harbor a multiplicity of parasites, and so they have more than one disease. Okay, so the number of parasites is just incredible. Now, this list actually doesn't even include toxoplasmosis, doesn't include giardiasis or cryptosporidiosis, and those numbers are in the billions, but they're not quantified by the World Health Organization, so they're not on this chart. Now, in America, we are also afflicted with parasites. 90% of Americans, 90% of you, have parasitic mites living on your face. And 30 to 50% of Americans, 30 to 50% of you, have a potentially deadly protozoan parasite living in your brains. And I am the only person in this room who knows that he is negative for that parasite. So let's talk about some of the individual parasites, and there is no way in 1 hour that I can cover all of the parasites. So I'm just going to pick the major ones, the key ones, and for those of you who are curious, you can Google and learn about some of the others. So we're going to start right off the top with Ascaris lumbricoides, which is the etiologic agent of ascariasis, the most common parasitic disease in the world, and really the most common infectious disease in the world. It's amazing. Okay, this is what Ascaris lumbricoides looks like. So Ascaris lumbricoides is a gastrointestinal parasite predominantly. So it lives in the gastrointestinal tract. There are 2 genders. Can I turn around when I'm giving this talk? Okay. So there are 2 genders. They're males and they're females, and they can be distinguished because the females are larger and the males have this little distinguishing hook on the end. The males run about 6 to 8 inches. The females probably about 10 to 12 inches. To give you an idea of how common this disease is worldwide, my laboratory actually wanted to do a biochemical experiment on Ascaris lumbricoides worms. Now, you can't grow Ascaris lumbricoides worms in the laboratory. Their life cycles are too complex and we don't understand it. You need to harvest them from human hosts. Can't do that in the United States. It's not allowed. But you can do it in other countries. And so we had some friends in the Peace Corps in northern India who were actually teaching, and we asked them whether we could come there and harvest worms from their kids. And you can see the smiles on some of their faces. They're very happy to be dewormed. And so we give them the worm medicine. This is albendazole or mebendazole, and this is the same worm medicine that people in the United States give their cats and dogs to deworm them. I don't know, do any of you have cats or dogs? Parasitologists don't have cats or dogs. Let me tell you, cats and dogs are filthy animals. But anyway, after a couple of hours, out come the worms. And which end? Yes, they come out of the back end. And this is the typical bolus of worms in the average child in that classroom. And at the end of the day, we had 23 pounds of Ascaris worms. Now, one of the amazing biochemical features of these worms is that once they come out of the body, they start to die, and their metabolism goes awry, and they start to secrete 4 or 5 of the most foul-smelling substances known to humans. You can smell them from 100 yards away. It's quite amazing. So now, the worms actually, Ascaris is amazing in that there are almost 1.5 billion people who have the worms, and yet there are very, very few deaths that can be ascribed to Ascaris. Every once in a while, somebody will die who has such a large number of worms that it actually blocks the gastrointestinal tract, and it causes a rupture, profound sepsis. The person goes into shock, and they ultimately die. These worms are actually more interesting when the average person, of course, has a much lower worm load. And when somebody has a particularly small worm load, there are about 4 million Americans, by the way, who have ascariasis. And generally the worm loads are low. Then they tend to, instead of being sequestered in the gastrointestinal tract, they start migrating around for reasons that we don't know, and they look for alternative routes of exit. So they come out of people's mouths, they come out of people's noses, and their favorite place to exit actually is the lacrimal gland, the tear duct on the inside of the eye. So you can imagine, these worms tend to exit during the night. You can imagine a mother seeing a child like this, sleeping, and this doesn't cause injury to the child, but it does cause injury to the mother, who often has to be peeled off the ceiling. But needless to say, it's quite an amazing disease. Okay, that's just one parasite. There are a lot of others. So let's talk about the hookworms. So hookworms are actually fairly common in Oregon. This is what they look like. This is the female, and this is the male. Now, Ascaris worms they're big. If you pass a worm, you'll see an Ascaris worm. Hookworms are actually very tiny, dainty, thread-like organisms. They're probably about this big, and the worms, they're really cute. Of course, if you look at hookworms under the microscope, they're not so cute. They have these hooks, and they hook onto the insides of people's intestines, and they chew intestinal flesh, and they suck blood. Now, each little tiny hookworm consumes about 1/10 of a milliliter, maybe one tiny drop of blood per day. It's not very much. But if you add up all of the human blood that is consumed by hookworms worldwide, it comes to about 3 million gallons of human blood every single day. That's about how much human blood there is in the state of Oregon. Now, hookworm is actually common in the United States, particularly in Appalachia and the southern, southeastern rural areas where public health sanitation still is not up to Portland standards. And I just wanted to show you this slide, which I took out of a very old medical textbook in the OHSU library. And it depicts people somewhere in the South or Appalachia coming in for their weekly hookworm treatment. And then this is a slide which shows a bunch of kids, all of whom have had hookworm. And I know you can't read this, so I'm going to read this for you. So we're talking about this guy right here. It says, showing effects of hookworm disease, a small boy is Herod Moore of Heber Springs, Arkansas, called Chalky from the extreme pallor of his face. Pallor, pale, because he's extremely anemic. And as a consequence of that profound and prolonged anemia, he has exhibited growth and developmental delays. So it goes on to say, Chalky is 18 years old, weighs 82 pounds, that's pretty light, and uses chewing tobacco, snuff, and profane language. Now, I told you this was a very old medical textbook, and we use more modern texts now for our current medical students, but it illustrates the point. So now, hookworm infections you can actually get in the state of Oregon. And you can get in the state of Oregon, particularly in the summer months, when the migrant workers come up from Latin America, Mexico, Central America to come here to pick the fruits and the berries. And I don't know if any of you have any of you ever gone berry picking? Parasitologists would never go berry picking, but if you go berry picking, those places where you can sort of go in the commercial outfits and pick your own berries are all picked out by the commercial consortia prior to allowing individual pickers like you, and that's done generally by the migrant workers. And if the hookworms get into the soil, which they can and do, it does happen. The hookworms, if you come along and you have bare flesh and a hookworm comes in contact with you, that hookworm can penetrate your skin. And then it goes inside your body and it crawls up to your heart. Then it crosses over to your lungs, and then it crawls up into your bronchial, and then trachea, and then you swallow it at night, and it goes down into your gastrointestinal tract, where it hooks onto the insides of your intestines and chews away for about 6 to 8 years. Now, for those of you who own dogs and cats, you are not immune to getting hookworms from them. Dog and cat hookworms can infect humans. They just can't complete their entire adult life cycle within the human host. So a lot of parasites exhibit what's called species specificity. So human hookworms can complete their entire life cycle within the human host. Dog and cat hookworms, when they infect a human, cannot. What they do, though, is they can crawl around. They tend to get lost, and they migrate. This is a condition called cutaneous larval migrans, also known as CLM. It's a relatively benign condition that can cause very severe pruritus, which is itching, but it's not really of interest to clinicians because there's not much they can do about it except for palliative care such as Benadryl, et cetera, et cetera. So most physicians take very, very little interest in patients who have cutaneous larval migrans, except this young lady who caught cutaneous larval migrans here. She got it by sunbathing at Cannon Beach. Now, have any of you ever been to the beach? Parasitologists would never go to the beach. Let me tell you why. One of the things that you would note if you go to the beach is it's covered with sand. And what do you think dogs and cats do in the sand? This audience is clearly engaged in a lot of high-risk behaviors, but that's a subject of another lecture. Okay, now this is a slide that actually illustrates a point that I raised at the outset of the lecture. Remember I said that there are many people who harbor more than one parasite. These are the roundworms that were isolated from a stool sample of a single child. There are 3 different genera of parasites. The first is hookworm. You know all about hookworm. You can see how tiny this is. This is a small nail or a pin. Very, very small. Even smaller is this parasite up here called Enterobius formicularis, which is the smallest of the gastrointestinal parasites. It actually lives in the anal region and causes pruritus or itching. It's also known as pinworms. Have you heard of pinworms? Okay, so pinworms are actually very common in the United States, particularly among small children, in daycare centers, kindergartners, first graders, where the fecal-oral route of disease transmission is fairly common. Most people think of young children, small children, as cute and warm and cuddly and wonderful. We parasitologists understand that young children are filthy, disgusting organisms that should be avoided at all costs. I don't know if any of you have children at home, but you should certainly avoid them, or certainly any physical contact. Now, on the left is Trichuris trichuria. This is the causative agent of the 3rd most common parasitic disease. None of you have ever heard of it. It's also a gastrointestinal parasite. These worms are also known as whipworms, and they inhabit the gastrointestinal tract, but in a milieu that's different from Ascaris and hookworm. These Trichinosis worms live in the rectum, and the rectum is the organ at the end of the gastrointestinal tract that collects feces prior to exit. And if you have a heavy enough infection for a long enough period of time, they embed themselves into the rectal musculature and they chew away, and they can weaken the rectum to the point that it becomes protracted, which means instead of being inside the body, it comes outside the body. And yes, prolapsed rectum. And you can see, this is beautiful to a parasitologist. You can see the worms here. And this is actually, remember, this is a very, very common disease, so this sort of pathology is relatively rare, but you can imagine that in areas where Trichuris trichuria is really epidemic, that these poor patients don't have access to the tertiary care facilities, to the surgical procedures that are necessary to sort of deal with the disease. Okay, this is Trichinella Spiralis. It is the causative agent of trichinosis. Trichinosis is an incurable, painful, and often fatal disease. You catch this from pigs, and if you eat ham or pork or bacon, have any of you ever eaten ham or pork or bacon? Your parasitologist would never eat ham or pork or bacon, but if you do, you know that you have to cook it very, very well. And as a matter of fact, trichinosis has been known for thousands of years. Part of the very strict dietary regimens of religious Jews and religious Muslims, kosher eating, for example, involves the avoidance of pork. And that's because the ancient Hebrews, thousands of years ago, were fully aware of the dangers of eating undercooked flesh. It's actually a very interesting parasite. Trichinella spiralis ends up being an intracellular parasite in its adult form. But again, it's not a curable parasite. There are no drugs that can kill it, and it causes a very, very painful and devastating disease. Yes?
Big population in the United States. How many do you think?
You're worried. Probably relatively few, because the pigs actually catch it from humans, the humans catch it. And so if you break that cycle, which we have largely in this country, but in the tropical and subtropical regions of the world, trichinosis is still very, very common.
And they do pig vegetables too.
And they do. Right. I don't think that is a way that another pig can catch that parasite, because these are complex organisms. So they go through a number of developmental stages. So to infect a naive host, they have to have a certain developmental stage. Okay, so this is the slide that scares me the most. Does anybody know what this is? Oh, I have to stand in the light. This is a proboscis of a female Culex mosquito. And from her proboscis are the larvae of a roundworm parasite called Wuchereria bancrofti, which is the causative agent of filariasis. So when she takes a blood meal, and by the way, I keep saying she. There is no gender bias intended here. It's only female mosquitoes that bite people. Male mosquitoes are relatively simple organisms that basically have two behaviors. They're involved in drinking nectar, and they're involved in mating. Some of you will recognize that is also the entire behavioral repertoire of the human male. But that is a lecture that I was not supposed to give. I used to give that to the medical students, and it wasn't the administration didn't mind the lecture, it was the laboratory that was associated with it. But anyway, you get the picture. And when she takes when she takes a blood meal, the larvae get in, and they eventually go and become adult worms. This is a adult female, this is an adult male, and they reside together in the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is the drainage system of the body. It's part of the immunological cleansing mechanisms of the body that drains lymph back to the heart. And when these worms are residing in the lymphatic system, everything is hunky-dory until the worms die. When the worms die, there's a granulomatous response that engulfs the worms, gets rid of the debris, that's good, but it also blocks the lymphatic system. And once you block the lymphatic system, you get swelling distal to the lesion. And that's filariasis. And that's filariasis. Gets better. That's filariasis. Now, filariasis is also known by a more common term called elephantiasis. And the reason they call it elephantiasis has nothing to do with the gargantuan proportions of the affected appendages, but rather what happens is that there is a secondary fungal infection that gives the skin an elephant hide-like appearance, an elephantine-like appearance, and that's hence the term elephantiasis. Now, elephantiasis does not just affect the legs and the arms. It affects any appendage that is drained by the lymphatic system. This is a woman who has elephantiasis of the breast. This is a man who has elephantiasis of the scrotum. It's actually a very, very common pathology in Wuchereria bancrofti infections. This man is actually a peanut vendor in a small town outside of Calcutta. And every day he ambulates to market with a wheelbarrow. And he goes to market and he uses his scrotum as a table to conduct his business, which is remarkably resourceful. Okay, this is Dracunculus mediensis, and Dracunculus mediensis is the longest of the roundworm parasites. It's about a meter long, and you acquire this parasite if you drink water. Does anybody drink water? But you drink water that's in turn infected with these little crustaceans, which are then infected with the larvae of this worm. And once the larvae get in, they develop into full-blown worms, and eventually they will exit. They exit wherever they want. And you can see this is about a meter-long worm, and it's an infected wound. And you can imagine in the hot, humid, tropical climates in which this worm is found, these infections can be very, very dangerous, if not fatal. Now, these worms are about a meter long, and they're about this round. And once they start coming out, they come out about 2 inches a day. What's one thing you do not want to do? Yeah, you don't want to pull, because you'll end up with 30 inches of worm inside of you, and that will probably cause a septic shock or a septic reaction. So what you do is you take the end of the worm and you wrap it around a stick and you tape it down. And every day it comes out a little bit more and a little bit more, and you keep taping and taping and taping and taping, and eventually it will extract itself from the wound. And you will never get a Dracunculus mediensis infection again, as long as you don't drink water. They haven't cured it yet, but they're working on it. The Jimmy Carter Foundation has spent lots of money and lots of resources in trying to combat this disease. And with nets and with straining and filters of the water, they've done a laudable job. It's not quite eradicated, but they're making great strides. It's also, this is the this is called the Guinea fireworm. Okay, so this is actually an insect vector. It's a Simulian black fly. And the Simulian black fly transmits a roundworm parasite, the last one that I will talk about today, which causes onchocerciasis, also known as river blindness. And the parasite actually, as an adult, lives in the inguinal region in these huge nodules. It can be very disfiguring, but that's not the major pathology. The major pathology is the eye. And it infects every part of the eye, and eventually can cause blindness. Now, this is actually a very interesting slide. It depicts villagers in some town, some small village in Central Africa. And one of the things that you will note is all of the adults are attached to sticks because they are blind. And all of the children are walking freely. They still have the worms. They've been bitten by lots of the Simulian black flies, which are the vector for this disease. But they haven't accumulated enough worms for a long enough period of time to experience the full pathology. They eventually will be blind, but they are not yet blind. So there's a very famous expression from that describes this disease called the blind leading the blind that originates from this disease. There's actually now a very effective prophylactic medicine called ivermectin, which is used to treat this disease. The real problem, of course, is in the delivery of the drug to the people who are susceptible to getting the disease. It is a prophylactic or preventative drug, but it does not cure the pathology. Okay, so we've talked about roundworms. There are actually 3 different phyla of worms that afflict people. There are roundworms, there are tapeworms, and there are flukes. And then once I get through all those 3, we'll talk about the protozoan parasites, the insect parasites, and the vertebrate parasites in the next half hour. So I'm going to speed up. So there are lots of adult interesting tapeworms, and the one tapeworm that you have to worry about in the United States is Diphyllobothrum latum, or the fish tapeworm, which Amanda talked about in a couple of her questions. Diphyllobothrum latum you acquire by eating undercooked fish. And there are actually some very uneducated and very naive people who actually eat raw fish. And this is a very good way to catch the Diphyllobothrum latum parasite. And I can tell you that the country of Japan, where they eat a lot of raw fish, has about 10 times the prevalence of this worm per capita of any other country on earth. I once did. How many of you eat fish? Because parasitologists would never eat fish. Okay, that's what I thought. High risk, high risk, high risk. I once did a dissection of 2 perfectly healthy, freshly caught fish in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. They were brought to me, and my job was to isolate parasites from these 2 perfectly healthy fish. And I found on those 2 freshly caught fish 14 different kinds of parasites in the first hour. So if you eat fish, you're keeping me in business. Thank you. Now, this is what a Diphyllobothrum latum parasite tapeworm looks like. This is a yardstick, and you can see it's probably about 20 yards, 20 meters long. And it's a little hard to magnify here, but if you look very carefully, perhaps you could see the striations on this one. Those striations are called proglottids, and they have both male and female parts. Now, there are a lot of primitive organisms that have both male and female parts. But Diphyllobothrum latum tapeworms, each of these little striations has 1 male part and 1 female part. And in fact, there are thousands of male parts and thousands of female parts. So the Diphyllobothrum latum tapeworm can mate with itself thousands of times simultaneously, and hence can lay about 2 to 3 million eggs a day. Okay, so now I want to talk about flukes. There are a number of different flukes that infect humans, particularly in the tropical and subtropical regions of the world. The only one that I have time to talk about today is Schistosoma species. It collectively cause schistosomiasis. This is the most deadly of the parasitic helminthic diseases. There are 3 species of schistosoma that infect humans: Mansoni, Japonicum, and Hematobium. And they affect either the liver or the bladder, depending on the species. So this is a Schistosoma mansoni pair. This is the male, this is the female, and they live in the mesentery, which is inside the body but just outside the intestine. And they mate 24 hours a day. We refer to this as incopula. And they lay a lot of eggs. I better correct my biology here. She lays a lot of eggs that migrate either to the liver or to the bladder, again, depending on the species, where they cause an inflammatory response that engulfs the eggs, but also destroys the effective organ. Now, both the liver and the bladder are essential organs, and so effectively, those organs in a heavy schistosome infection become cirrhosed. So you get effectively cirrhosis of the liver or cirrhosis of the bladder. It's a fatal disease. There are about 300,000 people worldwide who die from schistosome infections every year. So there are vectors. We have vectors for schistosomes. It's not an insect vector, but as you can see, it is a snail vector. So people acquire the infection if they go swimming in fresh water. Have any of you ever gone swimming in fresh water? See, parasitologists would never go swimming in fresh water. The reason is, if you ever look at a body of fresh water, there are birds swimming in it. And what do you think those birds are doing in the fresh water? They're pooping. And in fact, in the United States, you can't get human schistosomiasis, but you can get duck schistosomiasis. It's called swimmer's itch. And it's not a particularly dangerous disease, but it is very, very discomforting. And as a matter of fact, in a particularly hot summer about 8 years ago, they closed Lake Oswego because people were getting fulminant infections of swimmer's itch or duck schistosomes. Human schistosomes, however, are a serious disease. And this is a man from Egypt who has very serious cirrhosis of the liver. He has schistosoma mannsoni. 50% of the country of Egypt has schistosomiasis in various degrees. The Egyptians have always claimed that that is a United Nations plot, and they are right. Because when the United Nations dammed up the Nile River with the Aswan Dam to form Lake Nasser for irrigation purposes, this was in 1957, the water was stored, it flowed into these irrigation ditches, and it was wonderful for the agriculture, it was wonderful for the crops, it was wonderful for the people who were living there, and it was wonderful for the snails. And so people bathed in these irrigation ditches, they washed in their irrigation ditches, and as a consequence, they got infected with schistosoma mannsoni, and many died. These are two children who have schistosoma mannsoni infections, also Egyptians. It's a very, very serious disease. Again, as I mentioned, about 300,000 people worldwide die from schistosomiasis every year. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about the protozoan parasites. These are actually the deadly parasites. The worms are very benign. It's the protozoan parasites that are dangerous. And that's because there's not a single helminthic parasite that can complete its entire life cycle within the human body because they're complex organisms. So if you get a single worm, you're going to remain with a single worm. Not so with protozoan parasites, which are single-celled organisms that divide by binary fission. So if you get one, you'll get two, and then you'll get 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and pretty soon you have a fulminant infection that could pretty much overwhelm the body and cause very serious pathologies, if not death. For example, the malarial parasite. This is a female Anopheles mosquito taking a blood meal. You can see her proboscis. Whoops. And she's taking a blood meal. The last time that you were in an environment where Anopheles mosquitoes were endemic was when you walked in this evening into this audience, because Anopheles mosquitoes are all over the state of Oregon, and those of you who know your history of the Oregon Trail may remember that when the early pioneers came out in the 19th century, many of them died of infectious diseases, among which were malaria. Now, malaria has been eradicated in temperate climates within the United States. However, with the emergence of global warming, there is a very serious concern that a lot of these diseases will reemerge in temperate climates where they were formerly eradicated but once were. So, malaria is a red blood cell disease. It's not gross. It's nothing particularly striking about the disease per se, except for the fact that it's deadly. During the course of this lecture, 100 children in sub-Saharan Africa will die of malaria. So it's still very, very common. What happens is the red blood cells get infected, they eventually burst, and then they infect other red blood cells, and in a very periodic, interesting way, They cause, during this cycling, they cause fever and chills and vomiting and obviously anemia, and temperatures can go up. So in malaria, temperatures can go up 104, 105. They can literally fry people's brains. So it's a very, very deadly disease. Right now, I would say a decade ago, there were about 3 million people who died worldwide of malaria every year. Now it's down to about 750,000 because of global eradication efforts and also bed nets, which have been delivered to sub-Saharan Africa particularly. This is a child with cerebral malaria. It's a certain acute kind of malaria that's caused by one species called Plasmodium falciparum. And what happens is it doesn't actually get into the brain, but it infects red blood cells that sort of cling to brain capillaries and cause a failure of nutrients and oxygen and depletion of nutrients and oxygen in the brain, and they cause a coma. Once a child gets to this stage, there's very little a physician can do to treat the patient. This is a trypanosome. There are actually two kinds of trypanosomes. There are African trypanosomes and there are South American trypanosomes. This is an African trypanosome. Causative agent of African trypanosomiasis, and it causes a central nervous system disease, also known as African sleeping sickness, transmitted by this bug. Does anybody know what this is? Tsetse fly, right. I've been bitten by 4 tsetse flies. That were the last 4 times I ever cried. They take huge chunks of flesh. And fortunately, I was bitten by flies that were not infected with the trypanosome, but there are plenty of flies that are. This is a mother and child who have what's called West African sleeping sickness, and they were ultimately cured. The drug to cure African sleeping sickness is arsenic. Now, for those of you who will be surprised by this, arsenic is extremely toxic. Now, African trypanosomiasis is invariably 100% fatal if untreated. The arsenical treatment for African sleeping sickness is also often fatal. It kills about 5 to 10% of patients in the first 30 minutes. So it's quite a conundrum, catch-22, for any physician treating patients with African sleeping sickness. There is no vaccine against any parasitic disease, helminthic or protozoan. In part, it's because there haven't been great efforts to do that. And the reason is that the pharmaceutical companies are not vested in trying to develop novel chemotherapies or novel vaccines for the treatment of diseases of the tropical and subtropical regions of the world, because there's a tremendous investment, tremendous cost in developing drugs, and they're not going to develop drugs for areas of the world where the patients don't have the option of paying for them. So it's not a lucrative endeavor. There is no vaccine for any parasitic disease. Very good question. So,
why does ivermectin work so well as a deworming agent?
Ivermectin is, first of all, it's quite lipophilic. The specific mechanism is it blocks neurotransmission in these in worms. It goes after certain kinds of worms, not others, but it blocks neurotransmission, and basically what it means is they require, it's a paralytic for the worms, and so they die. And it's a very effective drug. So ivermectin, for example, for the treatment of onchocerciasis, you have to give 1 dose every 6 months. It's really a magic bullet drug. Discovered, actually avermectin, from which ivermectin is derived, was actually discovered in a sand trap in a golf course in Tokyo, which is how most drugs are discovered, by the way, sort of very empirically, but very, very effective magic. It's a great drug. It targets those worms. There's no toxicity, and if a person is compliant, it's a very effective drug. But it doesn't deal with the pathology. I'm sorry, what? You want me to tell? I'm sorry. So a typical pharmaceutical drug discovery program is that they send people all around the world and they collect samples of dirt and junk and gunk, and they grow it up into a stew, and they just drop it on organisms, and they see if it kills. And no, it's serious. That's what they do. And this ivermectin was discovered by Merck Sharp and Dome in Philadelphia, New Jersey. I can't remember which. And once they saw that this stew from a sand trap was killing all these worms in experimental models, they isolated the compound and developed it.
What number is arsenic on the periodic
33. Thank you, Heather. So back to business here. So this is a young man who had East African sleeping sickness. And the parasite had affected his behavior. His family recognized that he was sick, but he hadn't gone into a coma yet. And so they brought him to the hospital. And the parasite was affecting his brain, and it was affecting his behavior. And he became very, very disruptive. And so the hospital took him out to the parking lot, and they tied him to a tree, the physicians did, until he went into a coma so they could treat him. Now, we don't do this at OHSU, that's a disclaimer, but it was very effective. Okay, Chagas disease. This is caused by the South American trypanosome, causative agent of Chagas disease, the leading killer of young people in South America, despite the fact that the African and South American trypanosomes are related genetically, evolutionarily. They cause very, very different diseases. I want you to note 3 things about this heart. 1, it's no longer attached to a person. And that's because it's a fatal disorder. The second is it's huge. We refer to this as cardiomegaly, and it's a bad symptom because it's reflective of weakness of the heart. And then third in the bottom here, you have what's called an apical aneurysm. This individual literally had his or her heart burst and exsanguinated into their pleural cavity and died. Chagas disease is incurable. It's a very, very sad disease. It's very, very common. It's the leading cause of cardiovascular disease in the Western Hemisphere. We probably have, with immigration, especially illegal immigration, and I'm very sympathetic, but we probably have about 300,000 people in the United States who have this parasite. So this is the kissing bug, and I think I'll just show you. The kissing bug is endemic in the United States, I think in about 27 of the southern states. Very, very common. And most of the kissing bugs in the United States that are found, if you dissect them to see whether they harbor the Trypanosoma cruzi worm, protozoan parasite, they do. So the parasite is here. They just don't, these kissing bugs don't very often get in contact with people in the United States. It tends to be a disease of Central and Latin America. Okay, this is Leishmania. This is the parasite that I study. It causes a spectrum of diseases collectively known as the Leishmaniasis, transmitted by a sandfly. And they're delicate little sandflies. I can tell you a story about that if you want a funny story about sandflies, but I don't have time right now. I am? Do you know how many? The story that I was going to tell you is that I once visited, we work on Leishmania, and I once visited the lab where they have the insectorium for sandflies, this was at Yale, at Bob Tesch's lab, and I had flown across country to visit the lab, and there apparently had been a laboratory escape, and they shut down the building, and it was just completely panicked, so it's quite humorous, I suppose, but... Anyway, it causes collectively causes Leishmaniasis, and there are a variety of forms of it. This is a disease, Leishmaniasis, that in its cutaneous and most mild form has plagued our troops in the Middle East, particularly in Kuwait and Iraq and Afghanistan. Our soldiers are very, very familiar with the disease. Probably about 6 to 10% of our troops over there have come down with the cutaneous form of this disease. This is what it looks like up close. It's ugly, but it's a self-healing wound. It's not particularly dangerous. This is one of our soldiers who peed outside. Parasitologists would never pee outside, but he caught cutaneous leishmaniasis. This is the mucocutaneous form, very disfiguring. There have been some Discovery Channel and Nova shows about mucocutaneous leishmaniasis, and a very, very severe disfiguring disease. This is also mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. And this is a visceral form of the disease. This is actually the most deadly and dangerous form of the disease, caused by a parasite called Leishmania donovani, which is the parasite that I work with. This is a boy from Darfur in Sudan, and he had the visceral form of the disease. It is curable if you can get access to the medicine. It is cured by antimony. Antimony, for those of you who remember your periodic table, is 1 underneath arsenic, element number 51, and it is curative, but it does have some side effects. And but eventually the side effects were cured, and it turns out, this might be surprising to you, that this young man is he's very handsome young man. Eventually he got cured. Okay, Toxoplasma Gondii. This is a parasite that afflicts many of you, potentially deadly. And I don't have it, and you can ask me why later. And there are a number of different life cycle stages, and this is called the tachyzoite. This is the active replicating form when a person is initially infected, and then eventually the immune system kicks in. And it kills all of the actively replicating parasites, or at least most of them, but a certain fraction insist. They form these cysts or pseudocysts that reside in your brains, and they are teeming with dormant parasites that are held in check by your immune system. And everything's fine, as long as your immune system remains intact. But if you become immunocompromised in any way, such as patients with AIDS or an individual who undergoes various kinds of cancer chemotherapies, what can happen is that these cysts start to replicate again. How you get this parasite? I'll tell you in a second. But it's by high-risk behaviors in which I do not engage. So this is a patient with AIDS. This is a CAT scan of a patient with AIDS, and you see in this northwest corner what looks like a hole in the head. And the reason it looks like a hole in the head is because it's a hole in the head, and a patient with toxoplasmosis who has AIDS, we refer to this as the Swiss cheese effect. Toxoplasmosis used to be the second leading killer among the opportunistic infections that afflict patients with AIDS. Toxoplasma Gondii is also a disease of women and children. Congenital toxoplasmosis occurs when a mother acquires an initial infection during pregnancy and transmits it transplacentally to the growing embryo or fetus with potentially deadly neurological consequences. And those can include death, so premature death in the womb, so that can be a unwanted premature abortion. A child can be born to term anencephalic, which means with no brain, or microcephalic, which means a small brain, or hydrocephalic, such as this Oregonian child who eventually succumbed to the disease. It's actually quite common. It affects about 1 in 500 live births in the United States. And most people are not profoundly affected at birth if they have the disease, but there can be very severe neurological consequences. It's the leading cause of neurological birth defects in this country. Now, this is the definitive host, and this scares me. This is the cat. All cats, at least any of them that have ever been outside, are infected with Toxoplasma Gondii. This is what's referred to as the definitive host. The definitive host is the host in which a parasite completes its entire life cycle within that host. So if you have cats, you have probably been exposed to Toxoplasma Gondii, and this is the reason that obstetricians tell their pregnant patients that if they have cats, they should no longer take out the kitty litter. They should leave that to their partners. And that's certainly good advice, but probably the major route by which adults acquire the parasite in the United States and developed nations is not actually by exposure to cats or really cat feces, but rather by eating meat. Have any of you ever eaten meat? Parasitologists would never eat meat. Now, the reason we know that meat is probably a source of acquiring Toxoplasma Gondii infections is those countries in Europe where they eat a lot of raw or rare meat have much higher incidences of toxoplasmosis than the United States. In France, in some communities, the incidence of toxoplasmosis or Toxoplasma Gondii infections is as high as 90%. And at death, it's probably 99%. Okay, this is Giardia. Giardia lamblia is the protozoan parasite that is found endemic in the water supplies throughout the United States and all over the world. It's the reason that if you ever go backpacking or camping or hiking, you don't drink the water out of the streams and the rivers and lakes. You probably all know this. I had giardiasis is actually, it's a gastrointestinal illness. It's not fatal, but it causes very severe cramping, lots of diarrhea, bloating, gas. It's very, very discomforting. I had a friend who actually was stupid enough to drink water out of a glacier. And he acquired giardiasis, and he told me he was so sick the first week, he was afraid he was going to die, and he was so sick the second week, he was afraid he wasn't going to die. Now, there are some very good drugs for the treatment of giardiasis. One of them is metronidazole. It's also known as Flagyl. And it's a very effective medicine for getting rid of giardiasis and the Giardia parasite. But one thing that physicians will not tell you is that metronidazole is also carcinogenic. But I can tell you that if you ever have giardiasis, you will not care. Okay, so I'm going to finish up pretty soon. I'm at my 1 hour time limit. Just to tell you a little bit about the arthropod parasites, the ectoparasites. And these are mites. And these are the mites that live on your faces. And they're not particularly pathological. They hang on very tight, so I can see those of you who are already rubbing your eyes and eyebrows. You're not going to get them off. Now, there are certain kinds of mites that can cause disease. This is a child who has scabies. And it's a nasty little disease, but obviously not fatal. These are lice. This is a head louse. This is a body louse. This is a pubic louse. Pubic lice are transmitted venereally. Head lice, many of you are familiar with. Body lice are actually not a problem anymore, but they are the ones that you should be most afraid of because they carry microorganisms that transmit typhus, and they were responsible for many of the typhus scourges of the Middle Ages. But head lice is a common problem in families in Portland and Oregon and all over the world. And there are two the parasites. This is the adult, and this is the egg or the nit. And there are a lot of medicines, insecticides that can be used. They're fairly toxic, that are either over the counter or can be prescribed. And some kill the adults, some kill both. They're relatively toxic, so reapplications are discouraged by physicians. But good nit comb and patience is a good way to get rid of them. The best way I know of dealing with head lice, by the way, is mayonnaise. And if you get mayonnaise, can't be light mayonnaise. It's got to be the real stuff. And if you have an individual in the family who has head louse infection and you douse their hair with mayonnaise, a thick coating of mayonnaise, and you put them in a shower cap and you put them in the bed, it strangles the adults. And then you wash it off in the morning and all the adults are dead. It doesn't do anything with the nits, but if you reapply it every couple of days, eventually we'll get rid of the infection. It's also a terrific hair conditioner. Okay, so they hang on tight. You can't pull them off. Nit combs can get the adults, but generally it's tough to get the live ones. Okay, this is my last slide of substance. And this is the only vertebrate parasite of humans. And it's called Delia Serosa, and it's a type of catfish that parasitizes actually the gills of other catfish. There are about 1,300 different species of catfish. And it's small fish. It's about 2 inches long, and it's very, very thin and very, very slimy. And it's a freshwater fish. And it's part of its egg-laying behavior. It's attracted to streams of nitrogen, and particularly urea. Now, urea is the end product of nitrogen breakdown in the human body, and you excrete large quantities of urea in the urine. And if you ever go swimming in an area where Delia Serosa, also known as Candiru, is present, and you pee in the water, these fish can detect the urea gradient, and they will swim upstream, up the gradient, and they are capable of swimming through the urogenital opening, all the way up the urethra, through the bladder, and then they get into the ureters, which attach the bladder to each of the kidneys. The ureters are very tiny and small. They can't pass through. So they erect their spines and they die. And they cause a septic reaction that can be potentially deadly. So the moral of the story is that I want you to all take home tonight that if you ever engage in the high-risk behavior of swimming in fresh water, please, please, please do not pee in the water. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This podcast and the Science on Tap events are created by VIA Productions. If you'd like to find out more about how to attend one of our events, check out viaproductions.org. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/scienceontap_ORWA, and the last part stands for Oregon and Washington. As always, I'd like to say a thank you to my volunteers, the Minions. They've been helping me run events for years, and I couldn't do this without them. The Minions are Scott Fry, Michelle Herman, Jordy Humphrey, Sam Lauk, Rita Nygren, and Stephen Perry, as well as many others who have helped over the years. Thank you so much for everything. Also, a final thank you to Jonathan Coulton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set as our theme music.
You're a heart-shaped box of strings and wire in one badass fucking fractal, and you're just in time.